Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The air was crisp and thin as we climbed higher into the Cascade Mountains. The late afternoon sun glimmered through the gaps in the towering pines, casting fragmented beams of light onto the mossy forest floor. We were a group of 5 friends, lifelong companions who had decided to mark the end of our college years with a weekend of hiking and camping. None of us had much experience with outdoor adventures, but the allure of isolation, starry skies, and the promise of stories to tell drew us in. "Got the tents?" Alex called out, shifting the heavy pack on his shoulders. He was the planner of the group, always double-checking, always worrying. It was both endearing and annoying. Yeah, they're in my bag," Kate replied, rolling her eyes. She was the voice of reason, but her sharp wit often came across as sarcasm. Tristan walked ahead of us, humming a tune no one recognized, his easygoing demeanor a stark contrast to Alex's tension. He was the wild card, always pushing boundaries, always testing limits. Bridget and I, the quieter ones, brought up the rear. Bridget was my best friend since childhood, and though she rarely spoke, her presence was a comfort. As for me, I like to think of myself as the glue that held us all together. A little bit of everything, not too much of anything. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the sky was tinged with gold. The trees opened up to reveal a panoramic view of the valley below with a jagged ridgeline in the distance. It was breathtaking. "Perfect spot," Tristan declared, tossing his pack onto the ground. "This'll make a great base camp." We set to work pitching our tents and gathering wood for the fire. The camaraderie was easy, the jokes flowing freely as we stumbled through the process. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of a babbling creek. For a moment, the world felt right. The tents were up, the fire crackling, and the first hints of stars began to pierce the deepening twilight. We sat around the flames, passing a thermos of spiked cider, laughing as Tristan regaled us with exaggerated stories of his heroic college antics. The warmth of the fire was a welcome reprieve from the chill that crept in as the sun disappeared. "This place is amazing," Bridget said softly, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the firewood. She looked up at the stars, her face serene but thoughtful. "It's like we're the only people in the world right now. Until a bear decides to join us for dinner," Alex quipped, earning a groan from the group. "I swear, Alex," Kate said, shaking her head, "you're the only person who can ruin a moment like this." "Fine," Alex said, raising his hands defensively, "but when Yogi Bear comes for your snacks, don't say I didn't warn you." We laughed, the tension breaking. The night pressed closer, wrapping us in its quiet embrace. The first sign that something was wrong came not long after. We were sitting in a circle, lost in our conversations, when a sharp, distant sound sliced through the forest. A high-pitched screech that echoed and then disappeared as quickly as it had come. We froze, our words dying mid-sentence. The forest had been alive with the subtle hum of nocturnal creatures, but now it was deathly silent. The absence of sound was almost more unsettling than the scream itself. "What the hell was that?" Tristan asked, his voice lower, cautious. "An animal," Alex said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe an owl or something." "Doesn't sound like any animal I've heard," Kate muttered, clutching her jacket tighter around her. Bridget leaned closer to me, her eyes wide, her fingers curling into the sleeve of my sweater. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine, but I forced a reassuring smile. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's just stick close and keep the fire going." The words felt hollow even as I said them. None of us believed it was nothing, but we were too stubborn or too scared to acknowledge otherwise. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Alex volunteered to go into the woods for more firewood. None of us wanted to accompany him, and he didn't push it. We watched as his flashlight bobbed through the darkness, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely. We waited and waited. The minutes stretched, and unease settled into the pit of my stomach. The same unease I could see reflected in everyone else's faces. "Why is he taking so long?" Bridget whispered, her voice barely audible. "Probably overthinking it like he does with everything," Kate said, but her usual snark was missing. She was worried too. "Let's give him a few more minutes," Tristan said, though he had already stood up, pacing nervously by the edge of the firelight. When the flashlight reappeared, we all exhaled in relief. Alex emerged from the tree line, his face pale and drawn, his arms loaded with kindling. "Took you long enough," Tristan said, trying to mask his unease with humor. Alex didn't respond. He dropped the wood onto the pile by the fire and sat down heavily in his chair, staring into the flames. Something about his silence was wrong, unnerving. "Alex?" I asked, leaning toward him. "You okay?" He blinked, as if coming out of a trance. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thought I saw something out there, probably my imagination." The words did little to ease the tension. "What did you see?" Kate asked, her voice sharp. Alex hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. It was like a person standing way off the trail. I called out, but they didn't move, just stood there, watching." The group fell silent. The fire crackled, the only sound in the oppressive quiet of the forest. "It was probably nothing," Alex added quickly, his voice rising defensively. "Just shadows, or an animal that looked human-shaped. I don't know." But the unease was palpable now, thick in the air around us. As the night wore on, we tried to shake the fear, but it clung to us like a second skin. We huddled closer to the fire, talking in low voices, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves pulling our attention to the surrounding darkness. No one dared to mention what we were all thinking, that we weren't alone. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of us. We decided to turn in for the night, grouping into pairs as we had planned. I shared a tent with Bridget, who was uncharacteristically quiet, her face pale and drawn. We lay there in silence, the thin walls of the tent doing little to keep the oppressive weight of the forest at bay. Every noise outside felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I stared at the ceiling of the tent, my heart pounding as sleep eluded me. It was sometime in the early hours when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping against the outside of the tent. Slow, deliberate. It moved around us, circling the tent with an eerie precision. Bridget's hand shot out, clutching mine tightly, her breathing shallow. I didn't move, didn't speak. My entire body was frozen, every muscle locked in place. The tapping stopped, and then, in the stillness, a low guttural whisper came from the other side of the thin fabric. "Let me in." I couldn't breathe. The whisper was faint, almost drowned out by the pounding of my own heartbeat, but I knew I had heard it. I squeezed Bridget's hand so tightly that I felt her wince, but she didn't let go. Her wide eyes stared at me, tears threatening to spill over. We didn't dare respond. The whisper came again, softer this time, as though whoever or whatever was out there was leaning closer to the tent. "Let me in," Bridget whimpered, barely audible, and I shook my head violently, mouthing the words, "Don't make a sound." The tapping resumed, a slow, deliberate drumming against the fabric of the tent. It circled us once more, pausing near the entrance flap. My mind raced with every terrifying possibility, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think clearly. And then silence. The tapping stopped, the whispering ceased, and the forest around us fell deathly quiet once more. Bridget and I stayed frozen, straining our ears for any hint of movement outside. Seconds turned into minutes, and still nothing. Finally, I let out a shaky breath. "We need to check," I mouthed to Bridget. She shook her head furiously, her grip on my hand tightening. "I'll do it," I whispered, barely audible. Before she could protest, I slowly reached for the zipper of the tent. My fingers trembled as I gripped the cold metal, pulling it down an inch at a time. The faint moonlight spilled in, illuminating the forest beyond. There was nothing, no sign of movement, no footprints in the dirt around our tent, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "See," I whispered, turning back to Bridget. "It's gone." But as I turned back toward the opening, my blood turned to ice. Standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the faint moonlight, was a figure. Its body was unnaturally still, its head cocked slightly to the side as though watching us. It didn't move, didn't speak. I yanked the zipper shut, my hands shaking so violently I could barely make it fasten. "There's someone out there," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We need to wake the others." The others woke with a start as Bridget and I burst into their tent, our frantic whispers barely containing the panic threatening to overtake us. Tristan was the first to respond, grabbing the flashlight and shining it around the clearing. Kate and Alex followed, though both looked pale and shaken. "Where did you see it?" Tristan asked, his voice low and urgent. "By the edge of the clearing," I said, pointing toward the spot where the figure had stood. Tristan's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "There's no one there," he said, turning back to us. "Maybe you imagined it." "I didn't imagine anything," I snapped, the frustration and fear bubbling over. "There was someone watching us. I'm not crazy." Okay, Alex said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's just stay together, all right? No one goes off alone." We agreed, huddling around the fire, which Tristan reignited despite our dwindling supply of wood. The warmth helped, but only slightly. The oppressive sense of being watched never left, even as the hours dragged on. At some point, exhaustion overtook us. Despite our fear, sleep crept in, stealing minutes and then hours. I woke with a start just before dawn, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The others were still asleep, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. But something was wrong. I did a quick head count, my stomach sinking as I realized someone was missing. "Where's Kate?" I whispered, shaking Alex awake. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with alarm. "What do you mean? She was right there." But her sleeping bag was empty, her pack still lying untouched by the fire. We scrambled to our feet, panic setting in. "Kate," Tristan called, his voice echoing through the forest. "Kate, where are you?" There was no response, only the rustling of leaves in the early morning breeze. "We have to find her," Alex said, his voice trembling. "She wouldn't just wander off." "No," Tristan said firmly. "We stick together. If we split up, we'll never find her. She'll come back. She has to." As the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, we packed up our camp in silence. No one wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew. Kate wasn't coming back. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed the night's silence and our sense of safety. We found the trail leading back to the car and started walking, the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavily on us. Every snapping twig and distant rustle set my nerves on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Halfway down the trail, Bridget let out a sharp cry, pointing to a spot just off the path. A streak of crimson marred the otherwise green undergrowth, a faint but unmistakable trail of blood. "Oh God," Alex whispered, his face going pale. "Is that Kate?" "We don't know that," Tristan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It could be an animal." "We need to get out of here," Bridget said, her voice trembling. "Now!" No one argued. We quickened our pace, but the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser, the path less defined. The trail of blood reappeared sporadically, leading us deeper into the woods even as we tried to stay on course. And then, up ahead, we saw it. Kate's scarf, torn and bloodied, hanging from a low branch like a macabre flag. Kate's scarf hung like a warning sign, swaying gently in the breeze. The vibrant red pattern we all knew so well was now darkened with dried blood. Bridget gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her knees buckled. Tristan caught her just before she collapsed. "We're leaving now," he said, his voice low and firm. "No more waiting, no more looking. We follow the trail back to the car and we don't stop for anything." No one argued. Alex looked like he wanted to say something, but the words caught in his throat. I felt cold, colder than I should have been. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, more primal. Something wasn't right with this forest. We resumed our march down the trail, but it felt wrong. The familiar path we had taken up the mountain now seemed alien. The trees pressing closer together, the underbrush thicker than I remembered. Tristan led the way, flashlight in hand, even though the sun was now high enough to illuminate the trail. The blood trail had disappeared, leaving us only with the unnerving silence of the woods. An hour passed, then two. The forest stretched endlessly before us, the scenery repeating in a maddening loop. We hadn't seen a single marker or landmark from our hike up. It was as if the trail was leading us in circles. "This doesn't make sense," Alex said, his voice tinged with panic. "We should have reached the car by now." "We must have missed a turn," Tristan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep going. We'll find it." "No," Bridget snapped, her voice trembling but resolute. "We've been walking for hours. We're lost." "We're not lost," Tristan shouted, spinning around to face her. His face was red, his breathing heavy. "We just need to..." The sound cut through the forest like a razor, a piercing guttural scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, our eyes darting around wildly. It was Kate's voice. "Help me!" The scream came again, ragged and desperate. "Please," Bridget bolted. Without thinking, she took off into the trees, her panicked cries echoing as she called Kate's name. Tristan swore and ran after her, leaving Alex and me rooted to the spot. "Bridget, wait," I yelled, but my voice barely carried. My legs refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer terror coursing through me. Alex grabbed my arm. "We can't..." Another scream cut him off, but this time it wasn't Kate's, it was Tristan's. A guttural, choking sound that ended abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "Oh my God," Alex whispered, his face pale as a ghost. "We need to run, now." Alex and I stumbled through the forest, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around us like specters. "We're going to die here," Alex said, his voice trembling as he glanced over his shoulder. "We're not getting out." "Stop it," I snapped, though my own resolve was crumbling. "We just need to..." A sharp crack came from behind us. We whipped around, the forest now eerily still. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but it revealed nothing except the gnarled roots and dense foliage. "Did you see that?" Alex whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "See what?" "There was someone, I swear there was someone standing right there." He pointed toward the trees, his hand shaking. I didn't see anything, but I believed him. "Come on," I said, grabbing his arm. "We can't stop. We have to keep moving." As we turned back to the trail, or what we thought was the trail, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, impossibly tall and unnervingly still, standing between two trees. My blood ran cold as its head tilted slowly to one side, as if studying us. "Run!" I screamed, and Alex didn't hesitate. We tore through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but the fear drove me forward. We burst into a small clearing, both of us skidding to a halt. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a cabin. It looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of years. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, the first sign of human life we had seen since the nightmare began. "Do we go in?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't stay out here." We approached cautiously, every step feeling like a mistake. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it open further. Inside, it was dark, but the faint glow of a fire could be seen at the far end of the room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No response. We stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under our weight. The air was heavy, the smell of damp wood and something metallic filling my nostrils. And then we saw it. In the corner of the room, sitting in a chair by the fireplace, was Kate. Her back was to us, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though listening to something only she could hear. "Kate?" Alex said, stepping forward. She turned slowly, her movements jerky, inhuman. Her eyes met ours, wide and unblinking, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice a hollow echo. Kate's face was a mask of distorted familiarity. Her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto mine, and the smile stretched across her face was wrong, too wide, too rigid, as if the muscles beneath her skin had forgotten how to move naturally. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small cabin. It sounded layered, as though multiple voices were speaking in unison, rising and falling in a disjointed harmony. "Kate," Alex whispered, stepping closer. I reached out to grab his arm, but he was already out of reach. "Don't," I hissed, my voice trembling, but Alex ignored me. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We've been looking for you everywhere." Her smile faltered, her head tilting sharply to one side with a sickening crack. The motion was so abrupt it made me flinch. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, began to twitch, the fingers curling and uncurling like a marionette on strings. "You should leave," she said, her voice lowering to a guttural rasp. "You don't belong here." Alex froze, his face pale. "Kate, come with us. We can get help." "Alex, get back," I yelled, finally finding my voice. Before he could move, Kate's body convulsed violently. Her head snapped backward, her mouth opening wide, an inhuman scream erupting from her throat. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the cabin and shaking the very walls. The fire in the hearth flared suddenly, casting grotesque shadows across the room. For a moment I thought I saw something standing behind her, a tall, impossibly thin figure, its face obscured by the flickering light, and then it was gone. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Alex's arm and yanking him backward. Kate's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Her body twisted unnaturally as she rose from the chair, her movements jerky and wrong. We bolted for the door, the floorboards creaking and groaning beneath our feet. As we stumbled outside into the clearing, the air felt heavier, the forest darker than it should have been. The cabin loomed behind us, its windows glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsating light. "She's not human," Alex gasped, his voice shaking. "That wasn't Kate." "I know," I said, my own voice trembling, "but whatever it was, it's still out there. We have to keep moving." We plunged back into the forest, the trees closing in around us like a living, breathing entity. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had taken Kate was following us. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing onto the damp forest floor. My lungs burned and my entire body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. Alex sat beside me, his head in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're not going to make it," he said, his voice breaking. "It's never going to let us leave." "Don't say that," I snapped, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. "We just need to find the trail. Once we're out of the forest, we'll be safe." But the forest seemed endless, an ever-shifting maze designed to trap us. The path we had followed earlier was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and gnarled roots. It was as if the forest itself was working against us. A sound behind us made me freeze, a low, rhythmic tapping, like the one I had heard outside my tent. Alex's head shot up, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint, familiar whisper. "Let me in." We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline propelling us forward. The whisper followed us, growing louder and more insistent, echoing through the trees. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that only deepened the shadows around us. And then, ahead of us, I saw it, the trailhead. The dirt path stretched out like a lifeline, leading to the faint glimmer of the car park in the distance. Relief surged through me, and I grabbed Alex's hand, pulling him toward it. "We're almost there," I yelled, my voice raw with desperation. But as we neared the edge of the forest, something stepped into our path. It was Kate, or what used to be Kate. Her body was twisted and broken, her limbs bent at unnatural angles. Her face was a grotesque mockery of itself, the smile now stretched impossibly wide, her eyes hollow and lifeless. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a guttural growl. Alex froze beside me, his grip on my hand tightening. "What do we do?" he whispered. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and swung it with all my strength. It connected with her shoulder, sending her staggering back, but she didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Alex toward the car park. We burst out of the forest and into the car park, the sudden openness of the space disorienting. The car was still there, exactly as we had left it, but the sight of it felt surreal, almost too good to be true. Alex fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the doors. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the door shut as I turned the ignition. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the edge of the forest. Kate stood there, her broken body silhouetted against the trees, her head tilted to one side. She didn't move as we sped away, her hollow eyes following us until the forest swallowed her once more. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, where we stumbled into a police station and tried to explain what had happened. They sent a search party into the forest, but they found nothing. No cabin, no Kate, no sign that we had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that forest. All I know is that we escaped with our lives, but we left a part of ourselves behind, something that will never fully heal. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I hear it, a faint tapping at my window, followed by a whisper that chills me to the bone. "Let me in." The air was chilly with the promise of rain, as my father and I trudged deeper into Pine Hollow, our boots crunching against the damp undergrowth. The sun hung low behind a canopy of dense pine trees, casting long shadows that danced with every shift of the wind. "Stay close, Nate," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a place to wander off." I nodded, tightening my grip on the borrowed rifle slung over my shoulder. Hunting wasn't exactly my thing, but these trips were important to him. They were a chance for us to bond, to carve out a few precious hours away from the humdrum of daily life. "See those tracks?" Dad pointed to a trail of hoofprints leading deeper into the woods. "Deer, probably 2 of them, looks fresh." He knelt down, inspecting the prints with the expertise of someone who had spent his entire life in these woods. "They're close." The thought of shooting a deer made my stomach churn, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't here to hunt. I was here for him. As we moved deeper into the forest, the world grew quieter. The usual rustle of squirrels and chirping of birds faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Dad," I said softly, "is it always this quiet out here?" "Not usually," he replied, his brow furrowing. "Stay sharp." The trail led us to a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to loom closer with every step. A faint rustling sound came from the bushes ahead, and Dad held up a hand to stop me. "There," he whispered, nodding toward the edge of the clearing. I followed his gaze and spotted them, a pair of deer grazing near the tree line. They were large, their antlers stretching skyward like twisted branches. Dad gestured for me to take the shot, but before I could raise the rifle, something changed. The deer's heads shot up in unison, their ears twitching. They turned sharply, staring into the shadows with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "What are they looking at?" I whispered. Dad didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the same spot, his grip tightening on his rifle. The deer suddenly bolted, their hooves pounding against the earth as they disappeared into the underbrush. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, sending a shiver down my spine. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Not sure," Dad muttered, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Let's move." We pushed through the undergrowth, following the trail the deer had left behind. The hum had faded, but an uneasy feeling lingered in its place. Dad stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Nate," he said, his voice low, "look over there." I squinted through the fading light and saw it, a deer standing perfectly still, its body partially obscured by the trees. It was one of the same ones we'd seen earlier, I was sure of it. "Why isn't it running?" I asked. "Don't know," Dad replied, stepping closer. "Something's not right." The deer remained motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glistened in the dim light, unblinking. It wasn't grazing, wasn't moving, just staring. "Is it sick?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Maybe," Dad muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep moving, give it space." We edged around the deer, careful not to get too close. Its eyes followed us as we passed, and I could feel its gaze boring into my back long after it had disappeared from view. By the time we reached camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in shadows. We worked in silence, setting up our tents and preparing a modest dinner of canned beans and jerky. The strange encounter with the deer weighed heavily on my mind, but I didn't bring it up. Dad seemed distracted, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet tension. After dinner, I retreated to my tent, zipping up the flaps and settling into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, and the sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owl calls, were a welcome comfort. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake, my heart racing. Something had roused me, though I couldn't say what. The tent was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the fabric. My ears strained against the silence, and then I heard it. A rustling sound just outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was probably an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe, or a hare. But then I heard it, a voice. It's breathing, though only barely. My blood turned to ice. The words were clear, spoken in my father's voice. But they were wrong, flat and emotionless, like someone reciting a line from a script. "Look down there at its chest," the voice said again. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. It had to be Dad. He must have been sleepwalking or playing some kind of twisted joke. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I raised the lantern, casting its light across the clearing. "Dad," I called softly. The camp was empty. I turned in a slow circle, the lantern's light flickering as I scanned the shadows. Dad's tent was zipped shut, the faint sound of his snoring coming from within. The rustling came again, this time from the trees. My stomach churned as I moved toward the sound, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. "Dad," I called again, louder this time. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then from somewhere deep within the shadows I heard it, a low guttural growl. I froze, the lantern shaking in my hand. The growl grew louder, closer, and I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything to emerge from the darkness. But the forest remained still. Shaking, I returned to my tent and zipped it shut, my heart pounding. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Morning brought a pale gray light to Pine Hollow. The trees cast long shadows across the damp forest floor, and a thin mist clung to the air. I crawled out of my tent, stiff and tired, to find Dad already awake, crouched by the remnants of last night's fire. He looked up as I approached. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Yeah," I admitted. "Did you hear anything around camp?" He shook his head, tossing a handful of dirt over the coals. "Nothing unusual. Why?" I hesitated, the memory of the voice still fresh in my mind. "I thought I heard you outside, talking." He frowned, standing and brushing his hands on his pants. "I didn't leave my tent last night. What did you hear?" I told him, though I left out the growling. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. "Probably just your imagination," he said when I finished, but the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "You don't believe that," I said. "Do you?" He sighed, glancing toward the trees. "This place, it can mess with your head. Makes you see and hear things that aren't there." "But the deer," I pressed, "and the voice." I said, "Drop it," he snapped, his voice harsher than I'd ever heard it. He softened almost immediately, running a hand through his hair. "Pack up your things. We're heading out." We moved quickly, dismantling the campsite and packing our gear. Dad's usual easy pace was gone, replaced by an urgency that made my stomach churn. The unease I'd felt the night before was back, stronger now, like a weight pressing down on my chest. As we made our way through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. "Stay close, Nate," Dad said, his voice low, "and keep your rifle ready." "What are we looking for?" I asked. "Not sure," he replied, "but I don't want to find out the hard way." We were skirting the edge of a large pond when we saw it, a stag standing in the shallows, its massive antlers dripping with moss. Its body was still, but its head turned slowly to watch us, its eyes glinting like wet stones. Dad stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Don't move," he murmured. The stag's gaze shifted between us, its nostrils flaring. It took a step forward, the water rippling around its legs. "Is it sick?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dad didn't answer. He raised his rifle, aiming at the creature, but he didn't fire. The stag's head tilted, its antlers casting jagged shadows across the pond. Then it spoke. "You wouldn't leave me behind." The voice was human, but wrong, flat and distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. "Run, Nate," Dad said, his voice trembling. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding as I tore through the underbrush. Behind me I heard the sharp crack of a rifle, followed by a guttural roar that made my blood run cold. Branches whipped against my face and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. The roar echoed through the trees, closer now, and I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. "Dad," I shouted, but there was no response. I stumbled into a clearing and skidded to a halt. The trees around me seemed darker, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. The hum was back, louder than ever. The clearing was wrong. That was the only way I could describe it. The trees leaned inward, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, cracked and weathered with age. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step forward, drawn to the altar despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and indistinct. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. "You came back," it said, the voice distorted and echoing. "Why did you leave me?" My voice caught in my throat. "I don't know what you mean." The figure stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid. "You left me to die." "I didn't," I stammered, backing away. "I don't even know you." It tilted its head, the gesture almost curious. "You will." The shadows around the clearing seemed to come alive, shifting and writhing like living things. The hum rose to a deafening pitch and the ground beneath me trembled. "Run!" Dad's voice cut through the noise, and I turned to see him bursting into the clearing, his rifle raised. Dad's arrival was a jolt of clarity amid the chaos. He barreled into the clearing, his rifle trained on the shifting figure at the altar. "Get behind me, Nate," he barked. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling as I moved toward him. The figure didn't flinch. It stood unnaturally still, its indistinct form shimmering in the dim light. "I warned you to stay out of these woods," it said, its voice a chilling mockery of Dad's. "But you always come back," Dad fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space, and the figure seemed to ripple, as if the bullet had struck water. It didn't fall. Instead, it shifted closer, the shadows around it surging forward like an encroaching tide. "Run!" Dad shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me toward the trees. We plunged into the forest, the hum rising behind us, a relentless vibration that seemed to pulse through the very air. I glanced over my shoulder as we ran, my heart pounding in terror. The clearing was gone, swallowed by the shadows, but the figure remained. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding through the trees without disturbing a single branch. "What is that thing?" I gasped, struggling to keep up with Dad's frantic pace. "Not now," he snapped, his voice tight with fear. "Just keep moving." We broke through the undergrowth and onto a narrow trail, our breath ragged. Dad stopped abruptly, turning to face the way we'd come. He reloaded his rifle with shaking hands. "It's still coming," he muttered, his eyes scanning the dark woods. "Dad, we can't fight that thing," I said, my voice cracking. "We have to get out of here." "Not yet," he said. "If we lead it back to the truck, we'll never escape. We make our stand here." The hum grew louder, a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The figure emerged from the trees, its silhouette flickering like a shadow cast by a broken light. Its voice cut through the noise, cold and mocking. "You think you can stop me?" it said, its form twisting as it advanced. "You couldn't before." "Shut up," Dad growled, raising the rifle. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," the figure replied, its tone dripping with malice. "You left me here to rot, and now you've brought him." It turned its head toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw a face. A pale, warped imitation of humanity, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. Dad fired again, the crack of the rifle splitting the air. The figure staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it let out a sound, a low, guttural noise that sent chills racing down my spine. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the trail in darkness. "We have to move," Dad shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran, the shadows chasing us like a living tide. The trail wound downward, the ground slick with moss and leaves. My lungs burned with every breath, but I didn't dare slow down. Ahead, the path opened onto a rickety wooden bridge spanning a narrow gorge. The river below roared with the fury of recent rains. "Cross!" Dad yelled, waving me forward. I hesitated, glancing back at the approaching shadows. The figure was closer now, its movements unnervingly smooth. I turned and sprinted across the bridge, the planks creaking ominously under my weight. Dad followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder. As we reached the other side, Dad stopped and turned, his eyes narrowing. "Keep going," he said. "I'll hold it off." "What? No," I protested, panic rising in my chest. "Just go," he shouted, his voice harsh. "Get to the truck and wait for me." I hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and loyalty. Then, with a final, anguished glance, I turned and ran. The truck came into view as I broke through the trees, its dark shape a beacon of safety in the oppressive forest. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys in the glove compartment. The hum was still there, distant but relentless. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the trail, willing Dad to appear. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The shadows around the truck seemed to shift, growing darker, denser. The hum grew louder, filling the cab with its vibration. And then I saw him. Dad stumbled out of the trees, his face pale, his rifle gone. He reached the truck, yanking open the passenger door and collapsing inside. "Drive!" he gasped, his voice raw. I didn't need to be told twice. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the accelerator, the tires skidding on the dirt before catching traction. We sped down the narrow road, the trees blurring into a tunnel of green and gray. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did you kill it?" Dad didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the dashboard, his face etched with fear. We drove in silence, the forest gradually giving way to open fields. The hum faded, replaced by the steady rumble of the truck's engine. I stole a glance at Dad. He looked older, worn, as if the events of the day had aged him years. "What was that thing?" I asked, finally, breaking the silence. Dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to call it," he said. "But it's been in these woods for a long time, longer than we've been alive." "You've seen it before," I said, the words more a statement than a question. He nodded. "Years ago, I was about your age. Came out here with a friend. Thought we'd camp, hunt, have a good time." "What happened?" I pressed. Dad's jaw tightened. "We found the altar, same as today. And it found us. My friend, he paused, his voice breaking. "He didn't make it." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was over," he said. "I thought it was gone. I was wrong." The truck rumbled to a stop at the edge of town, the safety of civilization a stark contrast to the horrors we'd left behind. But even as we stepped out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching. "What now?" I asked, my voice hollow. Dad looked out at the horizon, his expression grim. "We stay out of the woods," he said, "and we don't look back." But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The hum still echoed faintly in my ears, a reminder that Pine Hollow wasn't done with us. Not yet. The fire crackled warmly in the heart of Zion National Park, its embers casting flickering shadows across the red rock formations that loomed like silent sentinels in the moonlight. A group of friends, Jake, Emily, Carlos, and Sarah, huddled around it, sipping hot chocolate and sharing stories. "You want a real story?" Jake asked, leaning forward, the firelight catching the edge of his grin. "Not some ghost tale or cheap jump scare, but something my grandfather swore happened to him?" "Lay it on us," Carlos said, kicking back in his camping chair, a marshmallow slowly turning to ash on his forgotten skewer. Jake took a breath, his gaze growing distant as if conjuring the memory. "He told me about something he saw out in the desert, something that changed him. He'd never go camping after it, never even drive alone at night if he could help it." "Great," Sarah groaned, glancing at the dark expanse around them. "Just what I need to hear before sleeping in a tent." Jake smirked, but his tone turned serious. "He was camping near here, actually, on the edge of an old Navajo trail back in the 70s. He and some friends had come to the park for a weekend, but something happened." The group leaned in closer and Jake began his tale. It started innocently enough, Jake's grandfather had told him. The group had been hiking all day, enjoying the canyon's breathtaking views, the kind you only get in the Southwest. By dusk, they had set up camp in a secluded area, the cliffs towering around them like the walls of an ancient fortress. The air was crisp, the stars beginning to punctuate the indigo sky. Jake's grandfather, Richard, had noticed something off as they settled in. The canyon seemed unusually quiet, no crickets, no distant howls of coyotes, just an oppressive silence that felt almost physical. As the group prepared dinner, one of them, a guy named Ben, wandered off to gather firewood. When he didn't return after 20 minutes, they started calling for him, their voices echoing against the rock walls. Eventually, Richard spotted Ben standing at the edge of the camp, his back to them, staring into the darkness. "Ben!" Richard called, his voice tinged with irritation. "What are you doing?" Ben turned slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. The firelight caught his face, and Richard's stomach clenched. Ben's eyes weren't quite right. They were wide, almost feral, and his grin stretched too far, as though his face didn't fit properly. "Everything's fine," Ben said, his voice eerily flat. "Come look at this." Against their better judgment, the group followed. Ben led them to a narrow trail winding deeper into the canyon. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. Richard felt a prickle of unease as they came to a clearing surrounded by towering rock spires. "What are we looking at?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Ben didn't answer. He simply pointed at the ground. At first, they didn't see anything unusual, just dirt and scattered rocks, but as they looked closer, they noticed something strange. The ground was covered in faint, swirling symbols, etched into the dirt like ancient petroglyphs. "That's not Navajo," Carlos murmured, kneeling for a better look. "I've studied their symbols. This is something else." Before anyone could respond, the wind picked up, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of sulfur and decay. Richard's skin crawled and his instincts screamed at him to run. "Guys," he said, backing away, "we need to leave." Ben turned to him, his grin widening impossibly. "Why leave? The fun's just starting." Ben's grin remained fixed, his teeth catching the dim moonlight in a way that made the group feel cornered. Richard swallowed hard, glancing at Carlos and Sarah. Their faces mirrored his unease. Emily, usually the boldest, grabbed Richard's arm, her knuckles white. "Ben, this isn't funny," Carlos said, standing up and brushing off his hands. "If this is some kind of prank—" The wind howled through the canyon, interrupting him. It wasn't the natural whistle of air through rock. It sounded alive, full of malice. The stench of sulfur grew overpowering, and the dirt beneath their feet felt as though it were vibrating, as if the earth itself were alive. "We need to go," Richard said firmly, pulling Emily toward the path. "Now." "But what about Ben?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "That's not Ben," Emily said, her voice steady but her eyes wild. "Not anymore." As if responding to her words, Ben's body twitched violently, his arms and legs jerking like a marionette. Then he let out a guttural, unnatural laugh that echoed through the canyon. "Run!" Richard shouted. They bolted back toward the campsite, the narrow trail forcing them into single file. The wind roared around them, carrying with it strange sounds, half-human cries, guttural growls, and mocking laughter. Richard glanced over his shoulder and froze. A shadow was following them. No, not a shadow, something worse. It moved on all fours, its limbs elongated and wrong. Its eyes glowed yellow, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's, but its form was distinctly humanoid. "Don't look back," Carlos yelled, his voice cracking. Richard tore his gaze away and pushed forward, his legs burning as the incline steepened. Behind him, Sarah screamed, but he didn't dare stop. The campsite was just ahead, the faint glow of their fire a beacon of hope. When they burst into the clearing, Richard skidded to a halt. This was not their camp. The tents were slashed, gear strewn everywhere, and the campers were missing. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah cried, clutching her sides and gasping for air. Before anyone could answer, the creature emerged from the trail, standing on its hind legs now. It was tall, too tall, and its body was a grotesque mix of sinew and fur. Its face was human enough to be recognizable but distorted, with a jaw that stretched unnaturally wide and teeth that glinted like polished knives. "Stay together," Richard shouted, grabbing a burning stick from the fire. He brandished it like a weapon, though he had no idea if it would do any good. The creature tilted its head as if amused. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Its voice was low and gravelly, carrying the weight of countless years. Richard's grip on the stick faltered as the words washed over him, thick with menace. "Ben," Emily said, her voice breaking, "is that you?" The creature laughed, a horrible, choking sound. Ben was weak. He was borrowed. "What do you want?" Carlos demanded, stepping forward despite Richard's warning hand on his arm. The creature's grin widened. "This land is sacred. You defiled it. But there's a way to atone." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. It gestured toward the ground, where the faint symbols they had seen earlier were now glowing faintly in the darkness. "A sacrifice. One life freely given. The rest may leave." The group fell silent, the weight of the creature's words settling over them like a shroud. "No," Richard said finally, his voice firm. "We're not doing that." The creature snarled, and the wind picked up again, whipping through the canyon with such force that the embers of the fire flared to life. "Then you all die." As the creature circled them, its yellow eyes never leaving Richard's, he racked his brain for a way out. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him, about the old spirits that guarded this land, about the power of trickery and courage. "We need to distract it," he whispered to the others. "Get it away from here long enough to grab the emergency flares in Carlos's pack." "What if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It has to," Richard said. You saw it. It hates fire. It's our best shot." Emily nodded, her jaw set. "I'll do it. I'll lead it away." "No," Richard said quickly. "We stick together." The creature, sensing their plotting, let out an ear-piercing shriek. The ground shook and the air around them seemed to shimmer with heat. Richard didn't wait for it to strike. He lunged forward, swinging the burning stick at its face. "Go!" he shouted. Before anyone could react, Ben's figure shimmered, his body contorting like a reflection in rippling water. His features dissolved, revealing something monstrous beneath, a figure hunched and sinewy, its skin a patchwork of dark, leathery flesh, stretched too tightly over bulging muscles. Its face was elongated, resembling a coyote's, but grotesquely distorted. Yellow eyes burned like embers as it bared sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah screamed, stumbling back, but the creature didn't lunge. Instead, it cocked its head and emitted a guttural, choking laugh that sent chills down Richard's spine. "Run!" Richard shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm as the group scrambled back toward camp. The canyon seemed to twist and stretch, the trail they'd followed, now a labyrinth of unfamiliar turns. Behind them, the creature's laughter echoed, bouncing off the rock walls and coming from every direction at once. They reached the camp, hearts pounding, and frantically began packing their gear. But as Richard stuffed his sleeping bag into his backpack, a realization struck him. "Where's Emily?" They froze. Emily had been with them moments ago, but now she was gone. Carlos swore under his breath, "We can't just leave her." Richard looked back toward the dark trail. His gut told him that going back was a death sentence, but he couldn't abandon her. "Grab the flashlights," he said, steeling himself. "We'll find her." The three of them retraced their steps, their flashlights piercing the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel path. After what felt like hours, they heard a faint voice ahead. "Help me!" It was Emily, her voice weak and trembling. They broke into a run, rounding a bend to find her sitting on the ground, clutching her ankle. "Emily!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing to her. "Are you okay?" Emily looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I tripped. I couldn't keep up." Carlos helped her to her feet, but Richard hesitated. Something was off. The air around them felt wrong, charged with the same electric tension he'd felt before. Emily's hair was disheveled, her clothes torn, but her eyes, they weren't quite right. They seemed too bright, too alert, given her condition. "Emily," Richard said cautiously, "what happened back there?" She blinked at him, confused. "I don't know. I just ran." Her voice sounded normal, but Richard couldn't shake his unease. He exchanged a glance with Carlos, who shrugged as if to say, "What choice do we have?" "Let's get back to camp," Richard said finally. "We'll figure it out there." Back at camp, they lit a roaring fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows. Emily sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea Sarah had made for her. She seemed fine now, calm even, but Richard's suspicion only grew. I think we should leave at first light, he said, breaking the tense silence. Agreed, Carlos said. Whatever that thing was, I don't want to stick around to find out if it's coming back. Emily looked up sharply. Why leave? We're safe here. Her tone was light, almost casual, but there was something unsettling about it. Richard noticed the way her fingers tightened around the mug, the way her gaze lingered on the fire as if she were watching something none of them could see. Emily, Sarah said gently, are you sure you're okay? You've been quiet. Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, she said. Better than fine, actually. Carlos frowned. What does that mean? Before Emily could answer, the fire suddenly dimmed, the flames flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. The stench of sulfur returned, stronger this time, and the air grew heavy. Richard's heart raced as he turned to Emily, whose smile had twisted into something cruel. You should have left when you had the chance, she said, her voice layered with an unnatural, guttural undertone. The fire exploded outward, sending sparks flying as Emily, or whatever was controlling her, rose to her feet. Her body convulsed, her limbs bending at impossible angles, and her skin seemed to ripple as though something inside was trying to break free. Carlos grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at her, but she caught it effortlessly, her grip crushing the wood into ash. She threw him backward with a single motion, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Richard reached for his backpack, fumbling for the hunting knife he always carried. Let her go, he shouted. Emily, or the creature, laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on Richard's neck stand on end. You think you can stop me? It snarled. This land is mine. You trespassers will pay for what your kind has done. Richard's mind raced. He remembered his grandfather's warnings about old spirits, how they sought revenge for the desecration of their sacred lands. Was this one of them, a guardian, awakened by their presence? We didn't mean any harm, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. We'll leave. Just let us go. But the creature only grinned, its teeth glinting in the firelight. It's too late for that. The air crackled with tension as the creature lunged toward Richard. Its movements were inhumanly fast, a blur of sinew and malice. He barely managed to dive out of the way, the ground beneath him trembling as the beast's claws struck the earth where he had stood. Scatter, Richard shouted, scrambling to his feet. Make it harder for it to catch us. Sarah and Carlos bolted in opposite directions, their flashlights bobbing wildly in the dark. The creature hesitated for a split second, its glowing eyes darting between the fleeing figures. Then, with a guttural snarl, it turned toward Sarah. Run! Carlos yelled, hurling a rock to draw its attention. The projectile struck the beast's side, barely causing it to flinch, but it was enough to divert its focus. Over here, Carlos taunted, waving his arms. The creature snarled and charged, its powerful legs kicking up dirt and debris as it closed the distance. Meanwhile, Richard grabbed a burning log from the fire and sprinted after the creature. He knew he had only one chance to stop it, before it picked them off, one by one. With a primal yell, he swung the flaming wood at its back, the impact sending sparks flying. The creature roared in pain, whipping around to face him. Its eyes burned with rage, but there was a flicker of something else, fear. Richard realized that the fire hurt it, perhaps more than it wanted to show. Fire! He yelled to the others. It hates fire. The group regrouped at the campsite, each of them clutching a burning piece of wood. The creature circled them, its glowing eyes narrowing as it assessed their makeshift defenses. We can't just keep it at bay, Sarah said, her voice trembling. We need to end this. Richard's mind raced. The creature's words echoed in his head. This land is mine. You trespassers will pay. He remembered the strange symbols they had seen in the clearing, and the stories his grandfather had told him about spirits tied to sacred sites. This thing isn't just trying to kill us, Richard said. It's protecting something, maybe those symbols. If we can destroy them, It might weaken it. Carlos frowned. You want us to go back to that clearing? Are you insane? Do you have a better idea? Richard shot back. Carlos hesitated, then shook his head. Fine, but we're going to need more than sticks if we're going to make it. Armed with torches, knives, and a hastily crafted Molotov cocktail using camping fuel and an empty water bottle, the group made their way back to the clearing. The trail felt even more oppressive now, the air thick and heavy with the creature's presence. When they reached the clearing, the symbols were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sight sent a shiver down Richard's spine. This is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We destroy these, and maybe we have a chance. Before they could act, the creature emerged from the shadows, its form almost blending with the darkness. It moved with terrifying speed, knocking Carlos off his feet and swiping at Sarah, who barely dodged in time. Richard lit the Molotov and hurled it at the creature. The bottle shattered against its side, flames engulfing its torso. The creature let out an unearthly scream, thrashing wildly as it tried to extinguish the fire. Now, Richard yelled. Destroy the symbols! Sarah grabbed a rock and began smashing the glowing patterns, the symbols flickering and dimming with each strike. Carlos, back on his feet, joined in, using his knife to gouge the markings into the dirt. The creature, still burning, lunged at Richard, who held his torch out like a sword. Stay back, he shouted, his voice filled with defiance. The creature hesitated, its movements jerky and desperate. The symbols were almost entirely destroyed now, their glow reduced to faint, dying embers. With a final guttural roar, the creature collapsed, its body disintegrating into ash that was carried away by the wind. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged as the first light of dawn broke over the canyon. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, replaced by a calm stillness. Is it over? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Richard nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. For now. They returned to camp, packed up their gear, and left the park without looking back. None of them spoke during the drive home, each lost in their thoughts. Later, Richard would research the area and learn more about the land's history. The clearing, it turned out, had been the site of a sacred ritual ground for a long-lost tribe. The symbols they had destroyed were meant to bind the spirit of a vengeful guardian, awakened by their intrusion. Though they had survived, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. The creature might be gone, but the land's anger remained, waiting for the next unwitting trespasser to awaken it once more. Years passed, but Richard couldn't shake the memories of that fateful night in Zion National Park. Neither could Carlos and Sarah. What they had witnessed changed them, binding their lives together in a shared nightmare they could never fully leave behind. Richard delved into the lore surrounding the creature. He studied old legends, consulted anthropologists, and even spoke with native elders, piecing together fragmented stories of the vengeful spirits that protected sacred lands. Carlos, now a firearms instructor, began experimenting with custom ammunition designed to deal with the supernatural. Bullets coated in silver, infused with salt, and anointed with holy oil. Sarah, a survival expert, trained in tactical strategies and stockpiled supplies. The three of them knew it was only a matter of time before the creature, or something like it, resurfaced. One summer, reports of strange disappearances began to surface near Zion National Park. Campers and hikers were vanishing without a trace, their abandoned gear often found near faint, glowing symbols etched into the ground. Locals whispered about the old legends, but authorities dismissed the stories as superstition. Richard, now in his mid-30s, read the news with a sinking feeling in his gut. He called Carlos and Sarah, who had stayed in touch despite their attempts to move on. It's back, Richard said over the phone, or something just like it. We're going in this time, Carlos said firmly. No more running, no more being unprepared. The group met at Richard's home, turning his garage into a makeshift armory. Carlos laid out an array of weapons, AR-15 rifles, shotguns, and handguns, all loaded with custom rounds. He also presented improvised incendiary devices, Molotov cocktails, flares, and smoke grenades. Sarah unpacked survival gear, night vision goggles, thermal imaging cameras, and portable radios. "We're treating this like a mission," she said. "No mistakes." Richard added the final touch, a map of Zion marked with the locations of the disappearances. "We head for the last known site," he said, tracing the route with his finger. "And we don't stop until we finish this thing." The group arrived at the park just after dusk, the towering cliffs casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Armed to the teeth, they followed the trail toward the latest disappearance site, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The atmosphere was eerily familiar. The oppressive silence, the faint stench of sulfur. It was all coming back. They reached a clearing where the glowing symbols pulsed faintly in the dirt, just as they had years ago. "This is it," Richard said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Carlos scanned the area with a thermal camera. "Got something," he said, pointing toward a cluster of rocks. "It's moving." The group raised their weapons, forming a defensive circle. The creature stepped into the clearing, its form even more grotesque than Richard remembered. Its sinewy frame shimmered in the moonlight, and its glowing yellow eyes locked onto them with a predator's intensity. "You're not scaring us off this time," Carlos said, leveling his rifle. The creature snarled and charged. The air erupted with gunfire as the group opened fire. Carlos's custom rounds struck the creature's hide, causing it to stagger and howl in pain. Richard aimed for its legs, trying to slow it down, while Sarah lobbed a Molotov cocktail that burst into flames on impact. The creature writhed, its movements jerky and unnatural, but it wasn't going down easily. It lunged at Carlos, who rolled out of the way and fired a shotgun blast at point-blank range. The salt-infused buckshot tore into its torso, sending it sprawling. "Keep hitting it," Richard shouted, reloading his rifle. Sarah hurled another Molotov, the flames engulfing the creature as it let out an unearthly scream. It clawed at the ground, trying to escape, but the group pressed their attack, unloading round after round until it collapsed in a smoldering heap. The group didn't let their guard down. Richard approached the glowing symbols and began destroying them with a sledgehammer they'd brought along. Each strike dimmed the markings until they vanished completely, the oppressive air lifting with them. Behind him, Carlos and Sarah watched the creature's body disintegrate into ash, carried away by the wind. "It's done," Sarah said, lowering her weapon. "For now," Richard replied grimly, "but if it comes back, we'll be ready." The group returned to civilization, vowing to remain vigilant. They knew the land was ancient, its guardians tied to a past they barely understood, but they also knew they had faced it and won this time. Richard stored their weapons and gear, knowing it wouldn't be the last time they'd need them. The battle was over, but the war against the supernatural was just beginning. Together, they would be ready to face whatever came next. Months passed after their victory, and life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. But the scars of their battle ran deeper than the group wanted to admit. Each member tried to move forward. Richard immersed himself in studying the history of sacred lands. Carlos fine-tuned his custom ammunition, and Sarah dedicated herself to survival training. Despite their efforts, the memories of that night never faded. Then the disappearances began again. Campers, hikers, even seasoned park rangers vanished without a trace near Zion National Park. Local authorities dismissed the events as accidents or animal attacks, but Richard, Carlos, and Sarah knew better. Each report brought a gnawing sense of dread, and soon they began to see the signs: the faint smell of sulfur, claw marks on rocks, and glowing symbols etched into the dirt. Richard was the first to call an emergency meeting. They gathered at his home, their faces grim as he laid out the reports. "This isn't the same creature," Richard said, spreading photos of the disappearances across the table. "It's stronger, the marks are more elaborate, the attacks more frequent, it's escalating." Carlos leaned back, his arms crossed. We killed it. We destroyed the symbols. How is this even possible? It's not the same one, Sarah said quietly. Samuel warned us. When we killed the first, we upset the balance. Something stronger took its place. The room fell silent. They all knew what they had to do, but the thought of facing another skinwalker, one more powerful than the last, filled them with unease. But soon the signs became personal. Richard woke one night to the stench of sulfur seeping into his home. Carlos found claw marks gouged into his garage door. Sarah heard whispers outside her cabin, words she couldn't understand, but that filled her with a deep primal fear. One by one, they realized they were being targeted. It was Carlos who experienced the first direct attack. He was alone at his gun range, testing new rounds he had developed, when the smell hit him, rotten eggs and decay. He froze, his instincts screaming danger. Gripping his shotgun, he scanned the tree line surrounding the range. Then he saw it. A tall, hunched figure emerged from the shadows, its shape constantly shifting. It moved like a predator, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on him. Carlos fired a warning shot, the sound echoing across the range. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped closer, its body rippling as it morphed into a twisted version of Carlos himself. The sight froze him in place, a grotesque, mocking doppelganger. "Carlos," it said in a voice eerily similar to his own, "you can't stop me." Carlos fired directly at its chest. The blessed round struck true, but the creature only staggered, its twisted grin widening. It lunged, forcing him to dive behind a barricade. By the time he scrambled to his feet, it was gone, leaving behind only the stench of sulfur and claw marks in the dirt. Shaken, Carlos called Richard and Sarah. "It's back," he said, his voice trembling, "and it's playing with us." The three met at Richard's home, their faces pale and tense. Carlos recounted his encounter, and Sarah revealed she had seen something similar, a figure lurking outside her cabin, its shape shifting between human and animal. Richard listened, his mind racing. "It's not just back. It's targeting us. The first one didn't do this. It just wanted to kill us. This one, it's personal." The group reached out to Samuel Greycloud, the elder who had helped them before. He agreed to meet at his home on the Navajo reservation, a remote and sacred place surrounded by red cliffs and endless desert. When they arrived, Samuel greeted them with a solemn expression. "I felt it," he said. "The balance has shifted again. This new spirit is older, tied to a deeper part of the land's history. It's not bound by the same rules as the last one." "What do we do?" Carlos asked. "Last time the guns worked, will they work again?" Samuel shook his head. "No, this skinwalker cannot be harmed by physical force alone. Its power is rooted in both the physical and spiritual realms. To defeat it, we must combine strength, yours and mine." He opened a weathered book filled with hand-drawn symbols and ancient writing. "These markings are not just for protection. They're part of a ritual that will weaken the creature's connection to this world. But the ritual requires time. Time you must give me." The creature didn't wait for them to prepare. That night it came for Sarah. She woke to the sound of tapping on her cabin window. Groggy, she reached for the knife under her pillow and crept to the window. The tapping stopped. Outside, the forest was still, the moon casting long shadows. Then she heard it, her own voice calling from the tree line. "Help me!" Her blood turned cold. She knew the creature's trickery, but hearing her voice twisted in desperation was almost too much to bear. The tapping resumed, louder this time, coming from the opposite window. "Leave me alone!" she shouted, gripping her knife tightly. The cabin door creaked open. She spun around, heart pounding, as the creature stepped inside, its form monstrous and fluid. It lunged, and she threw herself to the floor, slashing wildly. The blade connected, but the creature barely flinched. Before it could strike again, headlights flooded the cabin. Carlos and Richard burst in, their weapons blazing. The creature snarled and retreated into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering stench of sulfur. After the attack on Sarah, the group knew time was running out. The group returned to Zion, this time better prepared but fully aware of the danger ahead. They carried not only weapons but also sacred tools Samuel had blessed. Their plan was simple: lure the skinwalker to a trap where Samuel could perform the ritual to sever its spiritual tether. As night fell, they set up camp near a canyon overlook, a location Samuel had chosen for its spiritual resonance. The air was unnaturally still, the only sound the crackle of their fire. Samuel worked quickly, carving intricate symbols into the dirt and placing bundles of sacred herbs around the perimeter. "This circle will hold it temporarily," he said. "But once it realizes what we're doing, it will fight back." Richard nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. "We'll buy you the time you need." The first sign of the skinwalker's arrival was the stench of sulfur. Then came the wind, cold and unnatural, carrying whispers that seemed to emanate from the shadows. The fire dimmed, and a chilling growl echoed through the canyon. "It's here," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "Stand your ground." The creature emerged from the darkness, its form even more monstrous than the last. Its body seemed to shimmer, shifting between shapes: coyote, stag, human, each more grotesque than the last. Its eyes burned with an unearthly light, and its jagged claws glinted in the firelight. Carlos fired first, the blessed bullet striking the creature's chest. It staggered but quickly recovered, letting out a guttural roar that shook the ground. "Keep it in the circle," Samuel shouted as he began chanting, his voice growing louder with each word. The group unleashed a barrage of firepower, their blessed bullets slowing the creature but not stopping it. It lunged at Sarah, who barely dodged its claws, then turned its attention to Richard, its glowing eyes filled with malice. As the battle raged, Samuel's chanting reached a crescendo. The symbols around the circle began to glow, and the air grew thick with an electric charge. The creature let out a deafening roar, its movements becoming erratic as the ritual took hold. "It's working," Sarah yelled, reloading her rifle, but the creature wasn't done. With a burst of speed, it lunged at Samuel, claws outstretched. Richard threw himself in the way, firing point blank into its face. The creature recoiled, giving Samuel just enough time to finish the ritual. With a final, thunderous chant, Samuel drove his ceremonial blade into the ground. The earth trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the circle. The creature let out a piercing scream, its form disintegrating into ash that was sucked into the ground. The group stood in stunned silence as the light faded and the wind died down. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. "It's over," Samuel said, his voice weary. "For now." Richard approached him, his face pale. "What happens if another one comes?" Samuel looked out over the canyon, his expression somber. "The spirits are tied to the land. As long as it is respected, they will remain dormant, but if the balance is disturbed again, they will rise." Carlos nodded, his jaw set. "Then we make sure it doesn't happen." In the months that followed, the group dedicated themselves to preserving the land's sanctity. They worked with Samuel to educate locals and visitors about the park's history and the importance of respecting sacred sites. They also kept their weapons and rituals ready, knowing that peace was fragile. Each member bore the scars of their battles, both physical and emotional, but they had learned that unity and respect were their greatest weapons against the ancient forces lurking in the shadows. And so they remained vigilant, watching the land they had come to love and fear, ready to face whatever might rise again.